The dog would not stop staring at her head. For 3 days now, Shadow had been acting in ways that Maria could not understand, could not explain, could not reconcile with 10 years of knowing every twitch of his ear, every tilt of his graying muzzle. He would sit in front of her, motionless as a statue carved from obsidian and silver, and fix his honey-colored eyes on a spot just above her left temple, with an intensity that bordered on unsettling. When she moved, he moved. When she sat, he pressed his nose against her skull with a gentleness that felt almost reverent, almost pleading. Her colleagues at the community center had started to whisper about it, their concerned faces visible even when their words were not, and Maria had laughed it off with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent 17 years reading lips and reassuring others that everything was fine. But deep in the pit of her stomach, in that wordless place where instinct lived and thrived, she knew that Shadow was trying to tell her something urgent, something that would soon prove to be the difference between life and death. What her beloved dog had sensed, what had driven him to this strange and desperate vigil, would shock the medical community and make headlines across the nation. But to understand how a rescued puppy became a miracle worker, we need to go back to the beginning, to a rainy evening when a little girl's world went silent and she found salvation in the most unexpected place. Maria Castellanos was 7 years old when the fever stole her hearing. It came without warning, a virus that seemed ordinary until it was catastrophic, ravaging the delicate architecture of her inner ears with the cold efficiency of a natural disaster. She remembered the last sound she ever heard with the crystalline clarity that only grief can preserve. Her father's laughter echoing through their small apartment, the sizzle of her grandmother's famous empanadas in the cast-iron skillet, and the distant jingle of an ice cream truck making its summer rounds through the neighborhood. Then silence. Not the comfortable silence of a quiet room, but an absolute suffocating void that felt like being sealed inside a tomb. The doctors had used words that meant nothing to a child, who only understood that the music had stopped forever, irreversible, profound, bilateral sensorineural hearing loss. Her mother had wept in a way that Maria could see but not hear, shoulders heaving, mouth open in silent sobs that should have been the loudest sounds in the world. Her father had held her so tightly that she could feel his heartbeat against her cheek, a rhythm she would come to treasure more than any symphony she had lost. The months that followed carved themselves into her memory like scars. School became a foreign country where everyone spoke a language she could not access. Friendships dissolved like sugar in rain, her classmates unable or unwilling to bridge the gap that had opened between her and the hearing world. She learned sign language with the furious determination of a survivor, her small fingers bending into shapes that would become her new vocabulary. But no amount of signs could fill the loneliness that had taken root in her chest. It was precisely 6 months after her world went quiet that Maria found him. She had been walking home from her special education class, her backpack stuffed with books that promised to teach her how to navigate a world that no longer wanted to include her, when something made her stop beside the old dumpster behind the corner grocery store. She did not know what drew her there. Perhaps a movement caught in her peripheral vision, perhaps the inexplicable pull of fate arranging the pieces of a puzzle she could not yet imagine. She approached the rusted metal container slowly, her sneakers squelching in the mud from 3 days of continuous rain, and what she found inside would change the trajectory of her entire existence. A puppy, barely clinging to life. His fur was matted with filth and dried blood. His ribs protruded like the keys of a broken piano. And when he lifted his head to look at her, Maria gasped. His eyes were the color of dark honey, warm and ancient, and filled with a knowing that seemed impossible for such a young creature. But it was not just recognition she saw there. It was understanding. It was kinship. It was the silent acknowledgment of two souls who had been broken by the same merciless world and had somehow found each other in the wreckage. She did not know then that the trauma of his abandonment had left him partially deaf, that the injuries he had sustained had damaged the same delicate structures that the fever had destroyed in her. She did not know that they were mirror images, two beings marked by silence and salvaged by chance. All she knew, with a certainty that felt as solid as stone, was that she could not leave him there. She stripped off her jacket, wrapped it around his trembling body, and carried him home like she was carrying her own heart. Her parents had resisted at first. They were already drowning in medical bills, already stretched thin by the demands of raising a deaf daughter in a world not designed for silence. A dog seemed like an impossible addition, another mouth to feed, another responsibility to shoulder. But when they saw the way Maria's eyes blazed with life for the first time since the fever, when they witnessed the skeletal puppy curl against her chest with a trust so complete it brought tears to their eyes, they knew they could not refuse. She named him Shadow, because from that first moment, that was exactly what he became. Her shadow, her protector, her bridge across the chasm of silence to a world that had tried to shut her out. The years unfolded with the gentle rhythm of healing. Shadow grew from a frightened, broken puppy into a magnificent creature, his coat deepening to a lustrous black shot through with threads of silver that caught the light like distant stars. He was trained as a service dog by specialists who marveled at his intelligence, his intuition, his almost supernatural ability to sense things that humans could not perceive. He could detect a ringing doorbell from 3 rooms away and alert Maria with a gentle nudge. He could sense the rumble of approaching thunder and guide her to safety before storms she could not hear arrived. He learned to recognize the vibrations of smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, approaching vehicles, emergency sirens, all the sounds that the hearing world took for granted and that could mean life or death for someone like Maria. But there was something else, something that went beyond training, beyond instinct, beyond anything the specialists could explain. Shadow seemed to understand things that no dog should understand. He could read a room in seconds, his gaze sweeping across faces to detect the slightest flicker of deception or malevolence. He once refused to enter a building that, hours later, experienced a catastrophic gas leak that hospitalized dozens. He had barked frantically at a neighbor's door for 20 minutes until Maria finally investigated and discovered the elderly woman had fallen and could not reach her phone. Time and again, Shadow demonstrated an awareness that bordered on the miraculous, and Maria learned to trust his judgments implicitly, even when she could not understand them. By the time Maria reached 17, she had built a life that would have seemed impossible in those dark months after the fever. She had graduated high school with honors, navigating the complex social currents of adolescence with Shadow at her side, like a furry ambassador between worlds. College had followed, then graduate school, where she earned her degree in social work with a focus on disability advocacy. She wanted to help others find the support she had struggled so hard to obtain, to be the bridge for other silent children that Shadow had been for her. She now worked at a community center 3 days a week, counseling families navigating the labyrinth of disability services, and she loved every challenging, rewarding moment of it. Shadow, now 10 years old, and graying with the distinguished dignity of a creature who had earned every silver hair, remained her constant companion. His steps had slowed, his joints creaked on cold mornings, but his eyes were as sharp as ever, his vigilance undimmed by age. Maria had accepted the rhythm of their life together, the comfortable routine of a woman who had made peace with silence and found joy in the visual symphony of the world. She had friends who signed with fluid grace. She had colleagues who respected her expertise. She had purpose, meaning, love. She had everything she needed, or so she believed, until Shadow began his strange vigil, and everything she thought she knew unraveled like thread from a spool. It started on a Monday morning, so ordinary that Maria would later struggle to remember anything distinctive about it. She had been getting ready for work, brushing her hair in front of the bathroom mirror, when she noticed Shadow watching her in the reflection. This was not unusual. He always watched her, but something in his posture made her pause. He was rigid, every muscle taut with focus, his eyes locked not on her face, but on a specific spot above her left temple. She turned to look at him directly, and he did not move, did not blink, did not wag his tail or offer the gentle greeting that had been his morning ritual for a decade. He simply stared, with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand at attention. She signed to him, asking what was wrong, but he did not respond to the familiar gestures. He just kept staring at that spot on her head, as if he could see something there that she could not. She shrugged it off that first day, attributing his behavior to age, to perhaps a slight decline in his cognitive function that the veterinarian had warned might come. But the next day, it happened again, and the next, and the next. Each morning, Shadow would position himself in front of her and fix his gaze on that same spot above her left temple, unmoving, unwavering, with an urgency that grew more pronounced with each passing hour. By the third day, his behavior had escalated to something Maria could no longer ignore. He had begun pressing his nose against her skull, right at that spot he kept watching, with a gentleness that somehow felt desperate. He would whine, a vibration she felt through his body when he pressed against her, and refused to eat until she sat down and let him examine her head like a doctor conducting a consultation. Her colleagues at the community center noticed. Her parents called, alarmed by reports from friends who had seen Shadow's strange fixation. Even strangers on the street stopped to ask if her dog was all right, because Shadow would halt in the middle of sidewalks to stare at Maria's head with that same unblinking intensity, blocking pedestrian traffic, ignoring commands he had never failed to obey. Maria began to feel a cold tendril of fear curl around her heart. She had trusted Shadow's instincts for 10 years. She had seen him save lives, detect dangers, perceive threats that were invisible to everyone else. If he was trying to tell her something about her own head, about that specific spot he could not stop examining, then perhaps she needed to listen. Perhaps something was wrong. Perhaps something was very, very wrong indeed. Now, before we continue with what happened next, I need to ask you something. Where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your country in the comments below. I absolutely love seeing how far this community stretches across the globe. And if you are not already subscribed, now is the moment to hit that button and turn on notifications. Because what Maria is about to discover What Shadow has been trying to warn her about is something so extraordinary that doctors are still talking about it to this day. You do not want to miss this. Maria went to see her doctor on a Thursday afternoon, feeling slightly foolish as she tried to explain why she was there. "My dog keeps staring at my head," she wrote on the notepad she used for communication with hearing people who did not sign. "The same spot, every day, for almost a week now. He has never done this before, and he has saved lives with his instincts in the past. I know it sounds crazy, but I need to know if something is wrong." The doctor, a kind woman in her 50s, who had been treating Maria since childhood, did not laugh. She did not dismiss the concern as the paranoid fantasy of an anxious patient. Instead, she looked at Shadow, sitting alert and focused beside Maria's chair, still staring at that spot above her left temple, and she picked up her phone. "I am going to order you an MRI," she wrote back. "Your dog is trained to detect things humans cannot perceive. Maybe he is detecting something we need to see." The MRI was scheduled for the following Monday. The weekend that preceded it was the longest of Maria's life. She tried to distract herself with work, with friends, with the normal routines that had always brought her comfort, but Shadow would not let her forget. He slept with his head pressed against hers, his nose positioned precisely at that troubling spot. He followed her from room to room with a vigilance that had intensified beyond anything she had ever witnessed. Whatever he sensed, whatever invisible threat he had identified, it was consuming him entirely. On Sunday night, Maria lay in bed unable to sleep, Shadow's warm weight against her side, and she let herself contemplate the possibilities she had been avoiding. What if something was really wrong? What if there was a tumor growing in her brain, a mass pressing against structures she could not see, a ticking time bomb that only Shadow's impossible senses could detect? The fear was almost paralyzing, but beneath it, like a steady heartbeat, was something else. Gratitude. If Shadow was right, if there was something there, then his strange behavior might be saving her life, again. For the second time, her rescued puppy might be rescuing her. The MRI took less than an hour, but it felt like an eternity. Maria lay in the narrow tube, struggling against the claustrophobia that clawed at her chest, visualizing Shadow's face to stay calm. He was waiting for her in the lobby with her mother, who had insisted on coming for the appointment, and Maria knew that no matter what the results showed, she would face them with her family by her side. When the technician finally helped her out of the machine, his face wore the carefully neutral expression of someone who had seen things he was not allowed to discuss. He led Maria to a small waiting room, where her mother and Shadow immediately surrounded her with embraces and wet-nosed nudges of concern. They waited. The minutes stretched like taffy, each second an eternity of anxiety, until finally the door opened and the radiologist entered. His expression was not neutral. It was amazed. The doctor pulled up images on a computer screen, pointing to a spot that made Maria's blood run cold. There, exactly where Shadow had been staring, exactly where he had pressed his nose with such desperate urgency, was a shadow of a different kind. An aneurysm. A balloon of weakened blood vessel wall swelling against the delicate tissue of her brain, preparing to rupture. The doctor's hands moved as he explained, and Maria's mother translated into sign with fingers that trembled violently. Unruptured cerebral aneurysm. Significant size, high risk of hemorrhage. If it had burst, he said, you would have had minutes, maybe seconds. Most people do not survive a rupture of this magnitude. We need to schedule surgery immediately." Maria sank back in her chair, the room spinning around her, and felt Shadow press his head against her legs. He knew. Her 10-year-old dog, her rescued companion, her silent partner in navigating a world without sound, had somehow sensed a weakness in her blood vessels that the most sophisticated medical technology struggled to detect. The doctors had no explanation. They theorized that perhaps Shadow could smell chemical changes in her body, microscopic shifts in hormone levels or blood chemistry that indicated the aneurysm's growth. They speculated about the uncanny abilities of trained service dogs to detect seizures, cancers, drops in blood sugar, all through senses so refined that science could barely comprehend them. But Maria did not need explanations. She did not need theories or hypotheses or peer-reviewed studies. She only needed to look into Shadow's honey-colored eyes, finally peaceful, finally calm after a week of frantic vigilance, and understand that she was alive because of him. The surgery was scheduled for the following week. It was complex, dangerous, and terrifying, but Maria faced it with a serenity that surprised everyone, including herself. How could she be afraid when Shadow had already proven that miracles were possible? When she had living proof that love transcended language, that bonds between souls did not require words or sounds to communicate what mattered most? She survived the surgery. The aneurysm was repaired, the weakness reinforced with tiny coils of platinum that would remain in her brain forever, silent guardians against the danger that Shadow had somehow perceived. The recovery was long and difficult, but every step of the way, Shadow was there. He slept beside her hospital bed. He walked with her through the rehabilitation center. He celebrated every small victory with tail wags that Maria felt through the floor beneath her feet, vibrations of joy that needed no sound to be understood. The story made headlines, of course. Medical journals published case studies. News programs sent crews to interview Maria, to film Shadow, to capture the extraordinary tale of a deaf dog who had saved his deaf owner by detecting a brain aneurysm that would have killed her within weeks. Maria became an advocate for service animal recognition, speaking at conferences about the profound capabilities of trained dogs and the life-saving bonds they formed with their handlers. Shadow, now something of a celebrity, received certificates and honors and treats from admirers around the world. But through it all, Maria understood that the true miracle was never meant for public consumption. It was private, sacred. It lived in the quiet moments between a woman and her dog, in the press of a nose against her temple, in the patient vigil of a creature who would not rest until the human he loved was safe. 10 years earlier, a scared and silent girl had pulled a broken puppy from a dumpster and given him a second chance at life. Now, that puppy had returned the favor in a way that defied explanation, defied science, defied everything the world thought it knew about the limits of animal cognition and love. Maria stood on the balcony of her apartment on the 6-month anniversary of her surgery, the autumn sun painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Shadow lay at her feet, his muzzle resting on his paws, his eyes half closed in the contented drowsiness of a dog whose mission was complete. She reached down and stroked his silver-threaded fur, feeling the warmth of him beneath her fingers, and a peace settled over her that she had never known before. They had saved each other. That was the truth that the headlines could never capture. When she pulled him from that dumpster, broken and dying and abandoned, she had not just saved a puppy. She had given him a purpose, a reason to heal, a love so profound that he would spend every day of his existence in devoted vigilance. And when the moment came, when an invisible enemy threatened to steal her life from the inside, Shadow had been ready. 10 years of watching, 10 years of waiting, 10 years of quiet, patient love that culminated in a miracle that science could not fully explain. Some say that animals do not truly understand human lives, that their loyalty is mere instinct, that their protection is simply an evolutionary echo of pack behavior. But Maria knew better. She had seen the intelligence in Shadow's eyes from the moment their gazes first met, the ancient wisdom of a creature who understood suffering and compassion in ways that transcended species. Their bond was not about hearing or silence, about health or illness, about rescue or being rescued. It was about being seen, being known, being loved without condition, without expectation, without the need for words that neither of them could hear anyway. Maria bent down and pressed her forehead against Shadow's, breathing in the familiar scent of him, feeling his heartbeat synchronize with hers in a rhythm that needed no music to be beautiful. "Thank you," she signed against his chest, though he could not truly understand the words. "Thank you for watching over me. Thank you for saving me." And in the golden light of the autumn afternoon, with the city spread out beneath them like a promise, the deaf girl and her deaf dog shared a moment of perfect understanding. Heroes do not always wear capes. Sometimes they wear service vests. Sometimes they have 4 legs and fur the color of midnight streaked with silver starlight. And sometimes the greatest miracles come not from laboratories or hospitals, but from the unshakable bond between a girl who needed to be heard and a dog who never stopped listening.